You said so many things there. I don't know where to start. You know, sometimes they call us Andreas number 1, Andreas number 2, but this merger is a bit too much. It's good to see you again. For those of you who were at the pubinar yesterday, I hope most of you were there. The pubinar yesterday was the informal version of what we're about to do now. So yesterday we talked about Bodø/Glimt with the beer in hand. Now it's a bit more informal. I put on a tie. There'll be less Bodø/Glimt talks, unfortunately. We'll talk about the big picture, the big security picture in the north and how that's developing and also impacting the high north. Andreas Respotnik didn't distinguish, but I think it's perhaps smart, given that this conference is called High North Dialogue, and that he is now the director for the High North Center. But what is the High North? I mean, actually, in fact, the High North was a term that was coined by the Norwegian government to translate the Norwegian word nordområdene into English, the High North. The High North, in fact, actually, if you look at a definition of it, it means the European Arctic. So basically, where we're at right now. So what that means, in essence, is that we can talk about the Arctic, right? This vast region, the 8 countries, 4% of the globe. That is a massive space, right? But in this conference, at the center here in Bodø, we tend to focus on the High North, our Arctic, the European Arctic. We might not be able to talk all that much about the Canadian, the Alaskan North. We might bring in examples from it or discussions from it, but the focus really is what's happening in our part of the Arctic. And that's also where we'll put the focus in this session right now. So we have some officials with me that will join me on stage any moment now, and then we have some analysts who will actually tell us what the officials said. So I'll start by inviting the 3 officials. So starting with Eivind Vad Pettersson, who is a State Secretary at the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Eivind is basically in charge of everything related to security, so this is going to be an interesting discussion. I also want to as well invite Mats Bergqvist, who's the Secretary General of Arctic Economic Council. Sorry, Mats Quist Fredriksen, sorry, Bergqvist. Combination, yes. And last but not least, I want to invite Brigadier General Steinar Kongshavn, who is from the Norwegian Joint Headquarters. So here we have, in essence, we have 3 institutions. We have the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we have the Norwegian Armed Forces, or the Joint Headquarters, that is located just outside of Bodø, and we have the Arctic Economic Council, right, that is representing a lot of member institutions, businesses in the Arctic. So Eivind, I wanted to start with you. Since we're in Norway, we're in maybe not what the government often calls the capital of the Arctic, but us who come from Bodø, we call this the capital of the Arctic. How would you describe the situation today? How does it look, seen from Norway, the High North situation, the security situation, but also in general, the developments that is happening right now?
No, there's many ways of approaching it. One of them is to use a metaphor that's not new, but it's this is simple saying that the cold winds in the Arctic do not always necessarily originate in the Arctic. Meaning that in a world now with more geopolitical tension, conflict and war as well, of course that affects the Arctic indirectly as well, although these are not conflicts or tension as such originating in the Arctic. We used to refer to, as a slogan, so to speak, High North, low tension. We must be straightforward and honest and say that that's not a precise description of the reality as of today, but it still remains, however, on the slogan level, an overarching policy goal of the Norwegian government. It's in our interest to maintain as much stability as possible in our immediate region, and from the government's perspective, the High North is the most important strategic area of interest for Norway today and in the years to come still.
Can I ask you then, what does that mean in practice? I mean, you said it's the most important area of strategic responsibility. It has been for 20 years, right? Your boss, Espen Barth Eide, was part of defining it in 2005 as the most important area. But what does that actually mean in practice? How do you, as the government, implement that importance?
I mean, one way of it, explaining it, and apologies to any Swedes or Finns in the audience. I met the ambassadors at the airport, and they went to the mountain outside. Because I'll be a bit blunt and try to talk about the High North in Stockholm and Helsinki, and compare it to how it is to talk to High North in Oslo. This is completely different in terms of the national emphasis, perspective, prioritization of the High North. And it's also just a simple fact of our geography and the proximity to Russia to the east is now conducting for the 4th year full-scale, industrial-scale war of aggression against one of its other neighbors. And that has consequences for us as well. You would know well, I spent my childhood in Kirkenes, 6.9 kilometers away from what was then the Soviet Union and then became Russia, in my childhood growing up there. That has consequences as well, and in a sense, this is where Norway meets the world, so to speak, because this 197.7 kilometers land border for 4 decades was the only land border between NATO and Soviet Russia. Now that border, luckily, with Finland joining NATO, has become a lot longer. That's just one of illustration. In addition to all the opportunities, all the resources, the opportunities for growth, that we see in the Norwegian High North as well.
But then in the webinar yesterday, we heard from some voices more local to Bodø arguing that one of the biggest challenges is the demographic decline, right? That North Norway is if not being depopulated, that at least the population is not increasing, and that you mentioned Kirkenes and Sør-Varanger, eastern parts of Finnmark, our border with Russia, is also suffering from, say, a lack of people. Are you doing enough to deal with this problem in Oslo?
We could always do more. Let me share the story that my first demonstration in Kirkenes as a 4-year-old was that I was demonstrating in the streets to have kindergartens. And because there were no kindergartens when they're growing up, there's photographic evidence of it. I'm just using it as an example because that is now completely turned around. Now there's kindergartens for everyone, and it's free kindergartens in a large part of northern Norway. That does not solve the problem, but everyone dealing with demographics know that the golden ones are the young families with children in terms of having population growth. Actually, looking at the numbers, you're not right. There's actually increase across the board in northern Norway, but to be perfectly honest, it's the crucial factor is Ukrainian refugees, which is a bit of a sad reality. We remain ambitious in terms of not only stopping the decline, but actually turning it around. So it should not be for the lack of trying. We've done now a number of sort of individual oriented measures. Free kindergartens, for example, as one. Now I think we will be shifting our attention to more structural issues as well. And then, for comparison, go across the border to the northern areas of Sweden, and you will find no one. Go to the Canadian Arctic or the US Arctic, and it's a completely different world, meaning that it's also part of what differentiates the Norwegian Arctic from other parts of the Arctic. Everyone in this hall would know very well, but 1/10 of the Norwegian population still lives above the Arctic Circle. And although it's not up to the Norwegian government in the democratic country to decide where people should live, we remain ambitious in terms of doing what we can from the government side to facilitate people wanting to live, work, and strive here in the north as well.
And you're set to release a new Arctic strategy, or a High North strategy, right, in the coming months, just before the election. Any golden nuggets in there? Anything that will, as you say, deal with this in a more structural way?
Wait and see. Let me just give you one glimpse into it, and it's the geopolitical context has changed. So there will be a strong emphasis on the area where I grew up, the eastern parts of Finnmark. It's the proximity to Russia. It's to the extent that there's been indirect consequences of Russia's war of aggression and sanctions. They have been by far most strongly felt in the eastern part of Finnmark. So there will be a strong emphasis on that region specifically. But it's a full review of everything dealing with the High North, looking at what we've been doing over the past couple of decades in this sort of new geopolitical lens. So there will be a bit of news for many, but do not be surprised if there's a strong emphasis on the sort of most northeastern part of Norway as where we see the need to do more from the government side.
Okay, we're waiting in suspense, Ben. I wanted to come back to what you said about high north low tension, that's still a goal, right? Although it's not a description of reality, it's still a goal that Norway seeks to achieve. Things are not going great in terms of goal achievement, would you not say? I mean, should we not be worried? I was just confronted with numbers here by media saying that half of North Norway's population are now concerned that we might end up in a warlike situation with Russia within a couple of decades. Do you share the same concern?
Nope. And I have reason to I have more insight than the general population, so on the one hand, let me be very straightforward on that. There's no direct threat to Norway. We're safe. We're part of a successful military alliance that has now included Sweden and Finland as well, which has been a tremendous benefit for Norwegian security. Yes, there's a full-scale war going on in Europe now for more than 3 years, but the military situation in our immediate neighborhood has remained almost surprisingly stable and fairly calm. Based on one possible assessment that it's in the decision makers in Kremlin's consideration of their own interests to keep things fairly stable in our part of the world, being somewhat occupied in other parts of Europe. It's also reality, and this is public knowledge, in terms of the military capabilities on the other side of the border. It's rather empty when it comes to conventional land forces. Yes, in terms of Russian Sea, Navy, Northern Fleet Navy, in terms of their air force, in terms of their nuclear forces, largely intact. But in terms of land forces, almost gone. But the fundamental reality still is that there's no direct threat to Norway. Norway is not a threat to everyone either. And there's good reason to believe that we can continue forward with that as sort of the headline. Having said all that, of course, people's fears should be taken very, very seriously. And it's in the democratic government. It's not up to the government or the cabinet to decide what people think or what they fear. What it is our responsibility is to do what we can to make sure that there's good reason that people in Norway should feel secure. Also, people in the High North.
The part of that fear is probably also related to Donald Trump, right? And insecurity concerning NATO, statements about Greenland that I guess we'll get to in the panel in general. But are you worried about the future of the transatlantic relations?
A bit of worry is healthy. One should not take things for granted. Although the transatlantic alliance has been sort of a bedrock of the Norwegian security, European stability for at least 8 decades. What the Trump administration is doing towards Greenland and towards the Kingdom of Denmark is not okay. We've been very straightforward on this from the government side, is that the Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And as the Prime Minister of Denmark says, the future for Greenland is up to the Greenlanders to decide. And although the news overnight were somewhat positive in the sense that they're not, the Vice President and his wife and the National Security Advisor are not coming uninvited to Nuuk, but they're rather just the Vice President and his wife are going to visit the the Space Force base on the northwest part of Greenland. It's not okay the way the US is now dealing with a long interested ally as Denmark, or the way they are treating Greenland and Greenlanders. And the government of Denmark has our full support.
Do you fear that, given this way of dealing diplomatically with an ally, the way the US has dealt with the Kingdom of Denmark, do you fear something similar happening to Norway? Norwegian media has been speculating in Svalbard being a sore spot that potentially could attract Donald Trump's attention.
That's really poor journalism and poor speculation, because the differences are so many. Svalbard is part of Norway, just as much as Bodø is part of Norway. I read a piece in Politico this morning saying that Svalbard is 1,000 kilometers away from the closest city, being Tromsø. False. The closest city to Svalbard is Longyearbyen on Svalbard, because Longyearbyen is a Norwegian city. Later this year, we'll be celebrating the centenary of Svalbard's inclusion into the Kingdom of Norway. We have dealt over the past century with a lot stronger, in terms of numbers, for example, of Soviet presence on Svalbard. The numbers are now very low compared to what they used to be. We have long tradition and quite a bit of experience in handling those issues. No other countries have special rights on Svalbard. That's another misunderstanding. Yes, the signet companies or individuals of countries that have signed the Svalbard Treaty have certain rights, yes, and we respect that, and we're the guardian of it, and we believe we have successfully done so for a century, and we'll continue to do so for a century to come. But these comparisons between what's going on now with Greenland and Svalbard are, to be blunt, rather silly, because the context is so completely different.
Okay, we'll get back to Greenland in a bit, but I also wanted to turn to the more operational side of Norway's Arctic policy. I mean, Steinar Kongshamn, you're sitting in a mountain. It's, what, 30 minutes drive from here? And you're literally in a mountain with big screens, and on those screens, you're seeing the Norwegian Arctic, right? You're seeing what is 80% of Norway's maritime space. You're seeing Svalbard. You're seeing that whole massive domain and our border with Russia. From a military, operational point of view, what do you see on that map?
Just to provide some context, we do command and control on all operations globally, as well as in the high north. So we see the world, and we try to sort of fit that into the pattern. And one of our key tasks to the government and the decision makers is situational awareness. So what do we see? We see increased activity. Military, civilian, and commercial, there's an increase in pattern. On the military side, it's mostly allies. On the commercial and the civilian side, there's a lot of entities. We also see that the seasons that they operate within the high north is extending from climate change. We also see increased complexity. State actors, private entities, and companies are operating in the high north in different clusters than before. We also see an increased interest in the high north. And we also see new hybrid actors, like the shadow fleet, vessels to circumvent economic sanctions. And we also see fishing vessels that are doing covert activities like intelligence gathering or mapping of our critical infrastructure. And there is a new situation in Svalbard, in the high north, where you sort of is reflecting the interest-based versus the rule-based worldview. So, to sum it up, we see there is an increase in activity and complexity, particularly in the high north, but this is from a number of actors, not just Russia or military or commercial alone.
Are you worried?
Well, I think we are not worried, but we are vigilant. So we are focusing on spillover crisis into the Arctic. What happens in Ukraine when can that have a shift in the geopolitical? Worried about climate change as a driver of change within the Arctic that is pushing a lot of vectors on lines of interest. We're worried about accidents from the shadow fleet. These are vessels with poor condition, poor seamanship. And of course, we are worried about disruption of our infrastructure like we have seen in the Baltic Sea, where you have accidental or intentional damage of critical infrastructure. But I wouldn't say that we are worried. There is a dynamic situation with a new layer of tension. But I will not use worried. I will use that we are vigilant and trying to assess the situation and gather as much information as we can to understand what is happening and what is developing in the High North.
After Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, has that picture changed? I mean, we heard Eivind Pettersson highlighting how some of the Russian land forces are actually been depleted or moved away from the Arctic, but Russia remains, in terms of the nuclear capacity, second strike capabilities in the north. Do you see a shift in Russian behavior in our High North after 2022?
Well, we shifted our behavior in 2014 with Crimea. That was a clear cut on some of the previous relations we had with Russia. The High North is Russia's most important strategic direction, so we see that they are prioritizing the Northern Fleet, their nuclear capability for second strike, and to some extent their Air Force and sort of the Northern Sea route. What we do see in the High North is that the Russian behavior, militarily speaking, is more professional than we see in the Black Sea, or in the Baltic Sea, or when see from the Chinese in the South China Sea. So there are fewer incidents at sea in the High North than we have like comparable to other regions where Russia and sort of NATO are interacting in a confined space.
Okay. Can I ask you then about, also linked to the question of NATO? I mean, you don't need to weigh in on Donald Trump's commitment to NATO, but from an operational perspective, do you have what you need to manage this relatively tense, but still, as you say, in control situation? Do you have the capacities? Does Norway have the capacities?
Norway's defense concept is about the total defense and allies and a national defense working together. And I do think that is strong. The increased allied activity is making the military deterrence towards Russia in the High North stronger. So I think we have the means, but we have to remember this is an area that has 7 times the size of the Mediterranean. So in the increased activity and sensors in the space domain, we are being more and more aware of what we haven't seen previously. So the more sensors we have, the more context we have to investigate and sort of to make sense of. So I think we have the means and the capabilities, and I think we have, since 2014, developing our intelligence picture and sort of collection picture to be able to identify vessels of interest or abnormal activity patterns that we should be aware of. So we are looking at this at a larger picture, trying to move away from being reactive to single vessels or single incidents, but looking at this at more in a pattern of behavior and then trying to get ahead of the curve rather than just responding to single incidents.
One dimension of the debate that is going on in Norwegian media about the US, Donald Trump, and that administration's commitment to NATO has been that the US in many ways is reliant on us in our High North because what comes out of the Kola Peninsula on the Russian side might be a threat or is a threat to the US. Therefore, the US has a self-interest in maintaining close relationships with Norway. Is that an accurate assessment? Is that the way you see it?
I think that Norwegian interest and the US interest in terms of homeland defense, as the Secretary alluded to, are compatible and aligned. And I do think also there is, at least from the military side, a mutual recognition of Svalbard as Norwegian sovereign territory, and that we have a shared interest in understanding the High North as best as we can towards a shared actor, namely Russia, and sort of how this is playing in Ukraine and other events in the world are playing into that. And I do think, from a military professional, I try to separate the politics from the actions. And from the military side, we have a growing relationship with the US Armed Forces because we have similar interests, and they are aligned in the High North in particular.
I think we're all trying to separate politics from reality these days. Okay, I wanted to last but not least, I want to turn to you, Mats Kvist Fredriksen, Executive Director for the Arctic Economic Council. I mean, you're a Dane, but living up in Tromsø, the team with the second best football team.
But it's nice to be south.
It's not in the south, yes. But from a business perspective, from your perspective, representing business organizations, are you worried?
Yes and no. So what companies don't like, and this is not only for geopolitics, is uncertainty. You know, not knowing what will happen in the future, that's poison. You know, like companies will navigate if they have certainty. So let's say that a sanctions package might come, or sanctions package might not come. That affects the companies. So yes, that I'm worried about. On the other hand, I always say that President Putin has done more for Arctic infrastructure than anyone else in recent years. Why is that? Because suddenly we hear all these talks about investments in the north. And that's because of what's happening, you know, in Ukraine, that suddenly we are talking about investments in the north of Norway, in the north everywhere. And that creates hope and optimism that maybe we will get better infrastructure. Maybe we will get a railroad connecting Sweden, like an extra track connecting Sweden and Norway. This will benefit the private sector and it will benefit the defense sector. So there's also, you know, a little bit of hope and optimism in all of this, but it's very, very uncertain. Also for companies, let me give you an example. I sit on a bank that gives loans to SMEs in Greenland and the Faroe Islands. And we have never gotten as many requests as the past 3 months because the banks are saying no to giving microloans to SMEs in Greenland at the moment. Because the banks are saying it's uncertain where Greenland is going, you know, like in the near future. This is both political in Greenland, but it's also geopolitical. So that means that suddenly small SMEs can no longer get loans because of Donald Trump has a huge interest in Greenland.
Can I then ask you, do you see the businesses as being... Okay, so that's a concrete example of Greenland, right, and how the uncertainty is impacting. Do you see the same in northern Norway, northern Sweden, northern Finland?
Yeah, and I think it's very important what you started with saying, that there's a difference between the high north and the Arctic, because we always talk about the Arctic and says we have to support investments in the Arctic, and I always ask, is that also the Russian Arctic and the Canadian Arctic and so on? And it's often just the national Arctic, so it's important to differentiate. Let me give you one uncertainty and then again a positive. So when Jonas Gahr Støre, the Norwegian Prime Minister, went to China to sell fish, the same week there was and a lot more, but the same week there was the interest for Chinese investors in the port of Kirkenes. This is the complexity that we have to deal with, like to keep two thoughts at the same time. That at the same time, yes, we want to have investments. We want to invest in infrastructures, and Kirkenes is extremely important for this. But at the same time, the reaction was, this is critical infrastructure. We cannot accept Chinese money. And this shows the complexity, you know, that is a main market for our exports. But at the same time, and we want to have investments in the north, but maybe we don't want all kinds of investments. There's another example here is that when the war in Ukraine started and the sanctions regime came, it hit, you know, companies like Kimek is the best example. You know, their workforce came from Russia. Their main customers were also Russians, and suddenly that changed the whole environment. So this makes it, again, uncertainty. Then the government found a solution, and together with Equinor and so on, so now there's a solution. But uncertainty, that's really poison. That said, we do see that there has been increased investments in northern Sweden, northern Norway, and northern Finland. And there's never been as much collaboration as well. I would say we are talking a lot more in the north than we ever did before. And that's on all levels. You know, that's universities, that's public sector, and it's the private sector. So there are positives to take away from this. The good example, I think, is the Danish Prime Minister invited the Nordic Prime Ministers for a dinner in Copenhagen. And this shows, no, but in the times of trouble, you know, like you get together...
Forgot the Icelandic one, though. But,
they forgot the Icelandic. So maybe, I'm sure there was a good reason for that. But the fact that the Nordic ministers get together in times of trouble, you know, that's a positive to take from this.
Then what's the solution? I mean, you highlighted the solution to Kimek's problem in Sør-Varanger, but in general, so the problem is uncertainty.
Yeah.
But that uncertainty is not caused by the Norwegian government or the Nordic governments, right? It's caused by the Russian government first and foremost.
Yeah.
So what's the solution to it?
The solution is, and I would have said the same during COVID, I would have said the same before, is like long-term predictable framework conditions. Like that's what everyone likes. And this is the problem with election seasons. I mean, that goes for the US, it goes for Canada, it goes for Greenland, goes for Norway. When we know, where will we go in the next 4, 5, 6 years? So companies, when you buy a ship, you make an investment for 35 years, the payoff. You don't make an investment for 4 years. So you need to know you have a market or for the certain time. So we need this certainty in the framework conditions. We talked about Svalbard, for example. When I speak with the tourism sector there, they want to expand. They see a growing interest for tourism. But they want to build more houses, they want to build more hotels, they want to build more infrastructure. I know this, you can shake your head, but that's what the tourism sector is asking to expand. But this is also complex because of the geopolitics. So companies just want to know what's the framework we can work within long term.
Does that also link to the increasing discussions we've had, at least in a Norwegian context, maybe also in a high north context, about this balance between, we all want sustainable development, right? Whatever sustainable means, but there's a balance there. And then on top of that, indigenous rights, Sami rights have gotten a lot of attention over the last years because of issues with human rights violations and windmills, etc. Do you see this as an impediment?
Definitely climate is not being talked as much about as we did a few years ago, so clearly something is changing. There's a good example here is the mining sector. So in Sweden, they have been talking about overruling public interest to speed up the mining sector. We wouldn't have heard that a few years ago, that you would overrule public interest for the sake of getting critical raw materials. So something is definitely changing. We also saw the European Union came out with key projects they want to fast track in the permitting process. And in the Nordic region, if you look on the map, all of them are in the Arctic part of Norway and Finland, Sweden and Finland. So definitely some things is being fast-tracked, but this is also linked with development. So when we talk about mining, it's not only a defense issue, that's also getting, renewable energy. The same when we talk about investing in, let's say, power supplies, that's also a critical infrastructure now. So having enough energy so the Russians cannot turn it off, that's also is both sustainability to invest in wind turbines, but it's also a security and safety issue now.
Isn't perhaps the Arctic, given that the Arctic is a more environmentally pristine and maybe also fragile environment, and at the same time it is also the home to a larger share of indigenous population. So then fast-tracking, as you say, some of these projects, mining projects especially, or windmill projects in the north, in this environment, isn't that a contradiction or a problem?
It's very, very different. So I know we have similarities in the high north, but it's also very, very different when it comes to the dialogue and the coexistence and so on. I think the best example, I always use this example when I hear the argument about the indigenous rights, is in Greenland, 95% indigenous, 100% indigenous government. They are praying to get more mining. They keep saying again and again, we want more mining, we want more mining. The largest infrastructure project in Greenland right now is a renewable energy project. They have banned oil and gas in the government. So indigenous peoples is not just one box, one category. I think that's a mistake. Even in Norway, there's diverse voices about, do we want wind turbines or not? And I think it's very, very dangerous if we get into this polarizing world and we say, indigenous people has this opinion. And the same goes for North Norway has this opinion. Like just across Mo i Rana, we are a pristine environment, and just south, we are not a pristine environment. I think that's a mistake. We need to look at it not only nationally and Nordic, but also in a European context. What is it that the North can provide? We can provide a lot of renewable energy. We can also provide a lot of oil and gas. We saw when the invasion happened, it was Norway who came to the rescue of Europe with oil and gas from the North. So we can provide a lot of things from the North, both sustainable and traditional dark black industries. But we have to look at the solutions, and we need to put us into this snow globe and shake it and look at it and talk about the pristine environment. We need to actually say, we have the solutions. We have the mining, we have the fish, we have the energy, we have the innovation and the skills up here in the north, and we have space.
Eivind, as a representative of the government, do you look at it as a snow globe from Oslo?
Absolutely not. But unfortunately, that's still an image of the Arctic, of the high north, in many places across Europe and across the world. This caricature of it being sort of a huge nature reserve with polar bears and a few indigenous peoples. I'm silly, but it's necessary to keep telling the story that yes, we are in the Arctic right now, and people live completely ordinary lives as they would do here, as in London, Berlin, or Paris, for that sake. 10th of the Norwegian population above the Arctic Circle. This is not something exotic as such. It's an integral part of Norwegian life. Just to, if I may, to follow up, I was responsible for misunderstanding, but you were referring to the plans of the tourism industry on Svalbard, and you're perfectly right. They want to build more houses, more capacity. My slightly shaking of the head was my sort of internal voice previewing the government's response to it, not denying the statement. In the sense that Longyearbyen and Svalbard, as you will see from the white paper on Svalbard presented by the government, is now fairly close to maximum capacity. We welcome growth across northern Norway, but Longyearbyen and Svalbard, it's not a specific goal to have population, huge population growth. Of course, we're going to be flexible and pragmatic about things, but in terms, there's a different context that will need a bit of a different approach as well. And let me maybe add this. This is not a big disagreement. Elections are not a problem. Elections are foundations of democracy. We will have elections in September this year, and irrespective of the outcome, of course, the government will be campaigning for re-election. But the broad picture is that there's going to be stability and predictability in Norway compared to the roughly 200 other countries across the world. I think we do very well in comparison. Yes, elections have consequences, but the foundations will remain stable and predictable, whoever ends up winning that election.
Until Donald Trump says something again. We will bring on a couple of additional experts now to also give their thoughts. I wanted to welcome back again to the stage the rector of Nord University, Hanne Solheim Hansen. And then I want also to welcome Associate Professor from University of Greenland, Rasmus Leander Nilsen, to the stage. And then last but not least, Alina Bykova, who's a PhD student at Stanford University in the US and also part of the leadership group at the Arctic Institute. So these three experts will now tell us the truth of what the officials actually said. I want to start with you, Hanne. I mean, you gave your opening remarks about the importance of the High North Dialogue, turbulent times. But how do you see your role, Nord University's role, in this picture that we've just heard, in terms of military, business, and the government?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think partly contributing to stability is very important. Doing business as normal as we can, but keep our research going and do more cooperation, particularly among the northern countries. But also we have a terminology that has not been brought up yet, but science diplomacy, which also is a good way of keeping a form of stability. And I think in addition to the normal tasks that a university has, it's also really important that we show that there is possibility for a good career in the North. And I think that there are a lot of youths that don't see that until they've been here. In the good old days, Norway had almost all men were in the army, and most of them had actually a bit of time in the northern Norway. They don't have that anymore. And I think that gave a different picture of what Norway really is. So I think reinforcing the military activity and making sure that more people have the possibility to live in North is part of the military, but it's definitely also part of our task to bring them here.
But then do you take that task? I mean, do you grab it with the horns? I mean, we have two universities in Norway, in northern Norway, Nord University and UiT, Arctic University of Norway. Are you setting the, say, frame or the agenda for the Arctic debate? Are we?
You can ask. This is part of what we're doing today and tomorrow, aren't we? I hope so. But we can always do more. I'm sure of that. We do cooperate very tightly with the UIT, and I think the real task for us now, when the demographic trends are decreasing young cohorts, we need to do even more to bring the youngsters to us. That is the biggest chore for us as a university. Right
you mentioned science diplomacy. Do you think that, I mean, we all hope that we can return to maybe not post or pre-2014, but at least to some situation where we can have some form of dialogue with Russia and less tension. And you highlighted science diplomacy. Is that what you mean? Do you think that science and your job in academia is a way forward to cooperate with Russia in the future?
It is possible to cooperate with Russia once we have settled this reason for being a distance from Russia. Right now we follow the law, and we've been told to not cooperate on an institutional level with any scientists in Russia. Once that disappear, I think we have a lot of we have possibilities to regain that possibility. We do that with other countries. I mean, it is we want to cooperate even with the scientists that are run by governments that don't we quite agree with their values. So we have a system, we know how to manage that.
Because in a way, the premise of this conference, right, the High North Dialogue, the High North Center that Frode Melvik started 15 years ago, was exactly that, right? It was to cooperate with Russia. I've been in this conference before, and a lot of the audience had been Russian students, Russian officials. Do you think that's possible, to go back to taking a role as having dialogue with Russian students again?
Once the situation is ready for it. It's not right now.
Yeah. It's not an easy question to answer, I know. But it is important perhaps to recognize that this conference and the center was established to develop more of the mutual collaboration on a lower level.
I completely agree, and I mean it's really unfortunate that we don't have all the countries circumpolar attending this conference. Also the Americans. Okay.
Taking a bit of a wider circumpolar perspective, and I want to turn to you, Rasmus. Coming from Greenland, I guess you didn't fly direct from Greenland to Bodø. I checked on the map before coming on stage, and actually the distance between Nuuk and Bodø is shorter than the distance between Nuuk and Copenhagen. Just for your information. So, but I guess you flew via Copenhagen, right?
The Norwegian government gave up that futile exercise in the 1930s.
Yeah, we don't need to go into that history, no. But Rasmus, seen from an academic who sits in Greenland, we can get into Trump in a bit, but first and foremost, I mean, coming to the Norwegian part of the Arctic, and the debate we already heard about the demographic decline to some extent, or at least the challenges, the security situation, the proximity with Russia, hopes of maybe low-level cooperation with Russia in the future. How does it look compared to Greenland situation?
So I think there's a pretty broad consensus that we're talking about 3, 4, 5 different Arctic. And in pretty much every single Arctic conference I've been to within the last many years, someone is posing this joke that if someone is actually stupid enough to invade North America, it's a Canadian joke. If someone is stupid enough to actually invade the North American Arctic, the first thing we would do is to bring some tea and some blankets, because that just sounds too stupid to do it. There's been some, and I don't think any observers of Arctic affairs envision there's going to be an old school war in the Arctic. Maybe there's going to be like a very slim chance of the Scandinavian Arctic with Russia. Something like maybe 1%, maybe less. As you mentioned, it's very slim. Now in Greenland, we actually have a situation, we're not completely sure whether those mixed signals from Trump means he's going to annex Greenland in the not too distant future. this changes the geopolitical landscape quite a lot. And I know from actually like flying to this place, I've been to Thailand and Albania. I'm on sabbatical. I left Nuuk just before Christmas. So touring the world right now, I'm supposed to go to Alaska in 2 weeks. But in terms of science diplomacy, we actually have to put the US into a really strange Venn diagram now. We are not allowed to have meetings with the American partners from the Ministry of Foreign Relations, and Science is the same department and the same people. I have to get a approval to fly as be a visiting scholar in Fairbanks, which has been an agreement that goes way, way back, and we collaborate quite closely with the Ted Stevens Center, as I guess most of you do. And all of a sudden, we have to be really careful because science diplomacy is something that has been. We at the University of Greenland, we don't really have that many projects or any project that I'm involved with either Chinese or Russian colleagues. So it's been very theoretical. I've been making the argument that in terms of the Arctic Council, we should try to keep the working groups alive by doing a little bit of science diplomacy, but to a certain degree, etc., etc. Now that also includes the Americans, and we have a research center on foreign and security policy called NACIFIC. We have been focusing quite a lot of having friends in Canada and in the US. That's been the focus. That's been the focus of Naalakkersuisut, the Greenlandic government, as in public signals, and also what you can read in the foreign and security and defense policy that came out just a bit over a year ago. That's US all over the place. What do we do now? So maybe what will come out of this, that maybe we will look this direction a little bit again, trying to promote collaboration with Norwegian partners that maybe we have been doing for a while, because we've been so focused on a westward-looking science diplomacy that's completely different now.
So you're saying while we focus on Russia from this vantage point, your focus is really been North America, but that's not possible anymore, or at least the US is not possible. You still have Canada, right? You can throw a rock from the Canadian to the Greenlandic Arctic.
Yeah, that's been, and I even got some emails from retired people in Greenland and Denmark saying, couldn't it be Canada rather than the US? It is really complicated, I must say, yeah.
But when you talk about Nordic collaboration, I mean, I'm always fascinated by this Nordic talk that is going on right now. Everyone talks about the Nordics,
Sure.
these 5 countries. Yeah. But Norway, Sweden, and Finland are relatively similar, right? But the challenges that Greenland is facing, and Iceland is a whole different ballgame, but Greenland is so different, no? Then Bodø is not really comparable to Nuuk, or is it?
Actually, the field over here looks a little bit like home.
Okay. But in general, the challenges that the Kingdom of Denmark is facing on the island of Nuuk, no, on the island of Greenland, are they even comparable to the other Nordic?
In many ways, no. I mean, but Greenland is a weird hybrid entity. So geopolitically part of the North American Arctic, politically like a former colony of Denmark proper, and so that's been quite. So if I think had the election in Greenland that happened just the 11th of March, was it 6 months before? There's been so much more focus on the US in the campaign, because there's been discussion whether Greenland should actually, as a next step towards full independence, become a free association, maybe not with Denmark, but with the US or somewhere in between. Those voices are not that common anymore. I think Greenland is withdrawing itself from the US partnership. That there's only very, very few political voices from a party that only got 1%, didn't get elected, said that could trust Trump. But there are so many differences, but still some of the work that the Arctic Council has been doing in promoting entrepreneurship and more collaborations in some of the mayor meetings, forums, etc., and those track 2 conferences like this, with the focus that we can learn so much from each other, but there has been maybe a bit too much focus from the Greenlandic side on the US. That is probably going to change moving forward, yes.
Can I ask you just a quick question though on the Arctic Council? Because the Kingdom of Denmark is set to take over as the chair of the Arctic Council now in, is it 6 weeks or so? From 12th of May, I think, in Tromsø the handover is. How's that going?
Slow.
Slow.
Way too slow. I mean, I gave a presentation on the chairship in January of last year and in October last year, and I was stressing a little bit at the time because there's been some internal struggles within the Kingdom of Denmark. Who should be the Arctic ambassador? And Greenland won that chicken game so there was named one, Tobias, a really nice guy from Denmark who was going to follow as the Arctic ambassador, and Greenland's been voicing this for many years, that it should be an Inuk, it should be someone from Greenland, and they actually won that. But there's been some internal struggles which mean that they are so much behind on many, many ways. And I think we're guessing, maybe Mads know more about this, who is going to be the Arctic ambassador? It's probably going to be Kenneth Høgh, who is the Akinton ambassador, or the representation, head of the representation, Greenlandic representation in Washington, has been for the last 3-4 years a really senior diplomat who's really, really good. But because of the election, that got delayed a little bit more. So if I was stressed a year and a half ago that process was going really slow, I know they just hired a few people, new diplomats in Nuuk to take, because they're going to chair this Kingdom of Denmark chairship, which is really interesting and in many, many ways a good thing. And I applaud what the Greenlandic government has been doing, but we are on the verge of taking over a chairship from what I would say a very professional Norwegian chairship. Also said that when you took over, that was probably the best candidate to have steered through that specific time in history of the Arctic Council. The Kingdom of Denmark chairship is very much behind on a number of occasions. But the good thing is I think they know some of their priorities, working really close with the Inuit Circumpolar Council, having indigenous rights to the forefront of thing, and just know we need to keep the Arctic Council alive somehow and balance that of still having collaboration with the Russians and not killing the Arctic Council at the same time. Mm-hmm. So in many ways it is a simple task how to operationalize this, but that because of internal struggles, it's going way, way too slow, if you ask me as an academic. But hopefully they will manage as well as you have done.
Okay, we'll see. Last and not least, Alina, step a bit closer so I don't cover you. I wanted to turn to you. I mean, you're so, as I said, you're a PhD student at Stanford, this prestigious university in California. You're a Canadian with Ukrainian heritage, but you speak Russian. But you're also a US permanent resident at the moment. How do you analyze what is happening? I mean, you're following it from all different angles.
Yeah, I mean, I think making sense of what is happening in the US is a tall order, to be honest. Things feel very unpredictable right now. I feel like on the one hand, you have, an administration that's come to power that has been talking about many of the goals that they're pursuing for years, and they're realizing these goals through, many of these executive orders that they're passing. But then on the other hand, they're also sort of doing things that are completely out of left field in many ways. In the Arctic specifically, I feel like there's this discussion of claiming more Arctic territory, Arctic security, but then there's all these efforts to defund Arctic research, American science, American academia, so there's many different layers to this. I feel like it's so hard to say what will happen, where all of this is going at this point, because it feels like day to day so many things are changing, and it seems like the people running the show, like if that Atlantic article about the signal leak has shown anything, is that they are in complete disarray as well. So it's like, who's running the ship and where are they steering it? It's a little bit scary.
But I mean, from your perspective, who follows this, should we take these Greenland statements serious? I mean, I'm still questioning that. Yes, of course we have to take it serious when top officials says these things, and even the vice president is flying there today. But at the same time, Rasmus mentions annexation. Do you think the U.S. actually wants to control Greenland?
I mean, I think again, so difficult to say. As a person who was, born in Ukraine, the Crimea incursion is not that long ago. The things that are happening in Ukraine are happening now. I feel I'm not comparing the US and Russia on a level field. However, I do feel that, something about this sort of almost feels like triggering to me. Maybe that's my own personal history. But it's definitely very alarming. But again, on the other hand, you see the US administration defunding sort of domestic politics, defunding government offices in Alaska. They're laying off thousands of people. They're cutting down on science. They're denying climate change. So things that really matter for the Arctic. So how would they integrate a territory like Greenland or a territory like Canada when they are struggling to administer things in the US, when they're laying people off and then they're rehiring them because it's a mess. So I feel like it's so difficult to draw any conclusions because of how quickly everything is changing and because of this sort of cognitive dissonance between what's being said and what the reality is with all the funding cuts and all of the sort of actual moves that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, you also study Russia's approach to the Arctic, right, with your Russian language skills. And you hint at it and you're saying they're not the same. But, I mean, Russia and the US. But we've also seen communication coming out of the White House saying that if the US and Russia were to re-engage, the Arctic would perhaps be, or the Bering Strait, Bering Sea part of the Arctic would be the first place that they might cooperate. So do you think there's there's a real chance that the Arctic might be used for more cooperation between these two actors?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I mean, I think that's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit tricky these days. Yeah, Mats?
Just a quick comment on that. I think what is interesting related to that is when 2 weeks ago when the peace negotiation happened, the Russian negotiators came out and said, we made a deal on Arctic oil. That was the statement, that US investors would work with Rosneft and buy cheap oil at a discounted rate if they could manage to negotiate something around Ukraine. So that's... I think it's quite clear that the Arctic plays a role. Another argument you could use is in the State of the Union, you hear that he's investing trillions of dollars in LNG. And what is interesting about that, the business case for Alaskan LNG only works if Russian LNG doesn't get back to normal. So that's the question, what interest does he have to build up a Russian LNG, Arctic LNG again, because that will hurt the $1 trillion investment that he's doing together with Korea and Japan in Alaska. Yes, there's both ways. And then finally, I think for all of you who are geeks about security, you should read the annual threat assessment for all the national intelligence agencies in the US. They just came up with their threat assessment yesterday. And the front page, for the first time, the front page was Canada, Alaska, and Greenland. That is how the annual threat assessment and security is viewed in Washington. For the first time in history also, Greenland was mentioned in this threat assessment. The Arctic was mentioned 12 times as well, but it was all linked with China. And that leads to, we haven't talked much about China in this panel, but I think a lot of, at least what we see when it comes to companies and sanctions, a lot of the US Arctic interest is in the Arctic is also related to counter China.
Mm-hmm. But I wanted to ask you then, Alina, about the China question then. Is that what's driving? Because we saw, when Trump's first administration, we saw the talk about the Arctic really rose on the agenda around 2018, exactly the time when China released its first and only Arctic policy. Is China the real motivating factor here, you think?
I mean, I think it depends because in the 2024 Department of Defense Arctic strategy, China was number one, and it was very like China, Russia and China, and then somewhere down below like climate change. So I guess the question is, how much are they sticking to that policy? And it's so difficult to say, again, because as we saw with the signal discussion, which honestly really alarmed me, it's like how are these decisions being made and what is the sort of, where is the thinking going? Yeah, I mean, I think based on what we saw with the 2024 strategy, China was front and center. They put it above Russia, which I find very interesting. But at this point, my response is like, we should wait and see because everything is changing so quickly with this new administration. Like it's been 2 months and it just feels like the world is upside down.
We're so used to analyzing everything as a rational behavior, rational actor model, but this is not, as you say, the signal chat actually shows, this is not a rational behavior, the communications at least. But then a final question on NATO, I just wanted to jump in on that. Do you think, I mean, given we talked about Norway's dependence on NATO alliance, we collaborate with the US on defense issues quite a lot, and that's been increasing over the last years, as the Brigadier General said. Do you think Trump will, withdraw from NATO?
I mean, it's not impossible. One can hope that he wouldn't, because I think NATO is very important, especially in terms of balance of power with Russia and maintaining North Atlantic security and the global sort of status quo. But I feel like my response to all of your questions today is like, it's so difficult to say because things are changing so quickly and it feels very disorganized from what we're seeing. I would really hope not. And I do hope that, even though in many of the discussions, I think in the American government, there's a certain contempt for Europe that people have been observing and talking about. There are still strong alliances in Europe, and like we were saying about relying on Norwegian expertise in the north for the Americans, I think that's very important. So surely there's benefits to the US being in NATO as well, and
definitely.
pursuing their own security interests.
But just a final point, since you're a Canadian, you just came from Canada, how is this being perceived in Canada? I mean, we are far away from the US. Greenland is a bit closer, okay, but Canada is basically, most of the population lives along the US border.
The Canadians are very unhappy. In Toronto, every storefront has a Buy Canadian, like little Canada flag, placard. The people are boycotting American products. I'm struggling with Tim Hortons because it's partially owned by America and I love Tim Hortons, so I'm having an ethical dilemma. Many people are canceling trips to the US. So it's just a crazy time because it feels like the US is tearing up decades of relationships and foreign policy sort of established situation. Like Canada is their closest partner, yet they've started a trade war for no reason against them, and that also sort of, I think, plays into Arctic affairs as well, because it affects everybody, and especially affects people in the Arctic that are already struggling to get, materials, resources, and food at an equitable price, and prices are just going to go up.
Yeah. Hanne?
Yeah, I would like to ask that kind of question also to the policymakers here and also maybe the militaries, that when we've been used to a systematic order of the world and we have made long-term agreements and we are still running by those rules, is it so that we are sticking with our old traditional rules and then somebody is just running much faster than us and changing the world? Do we need to change the way we are dealing with things from our side of the world?
I'll let you answer that in a bit, Eivind, but first, Steinar, you had a comment as well?
I think regards to NATO, I think we have to distinguish between the US leaving NATO, which I don't foresee, but the US shifting forces from the European continent to the Indo-Pacific is highly likely. But for the US to leave NATO as a whole makes no political sense in either universe. But withdrawing forces from Europe, especially since Europe is sort of increasing their military power, makes good sense. And it's probably something that we expect, that there will be a change in the US forces in Europe to some extent, in some configuration, but we are not contemplating or assessing the US leaving NATO, because that will just leave them. They have influence in NATO, and that sort of should tail to also this administration's interest to be an active part of NATO as an alliance.
Rasmus, you had a short comment.
Just a strange anecdote. So during the Second World War, the US built several military bases in Greenland, and is still only operating one, the Pituffik Space Base, which was until recently called the Thule Air Base. The defense agreement from 41 and 51 basically stipulates that the US can treat Thule Air Base or Pituffik Space Base as their own, like that's a COP with the 51st state, that's Thule area. And there is a sentiment that the leash of that area in Greenland is viable as long as NATO is operational. So if the US is actually leaving NATO, I totally agree it's not highly likely. They shouldn't do from a strategic perspective. But if they actually were, then they will lose the access to Pacific space base. Having the deterrence to Russia in terms of bombs flying over Greenland to Washington or an attack of the North American Arctic. And it's something we think this is going to be forever and ever that they have the lease of what you can call it over Pacific space base, but that's actually something that could become very messy if the US chooses against what makes strategic sense to actually leave NATO or do something in that sense.